Listen, another episode, as usual, in the fascinating garage of my friend Krzysztof Pedrik, who has kindly made his treasure trove available to us for filming these videos. Previously, we discussed various types of engines, electric, steam, and then combustion engines. Where did frames come from? Well, some people complain here that this isn't really about automotive topics at all, but rather some kind of prehistory of the universe. Because indeed, in some parts, I had to go back, I would say, almost to year zero, or maybe even before our era. But what can I do? That's just how people started, so to speak, to drive. And that's how it all happened. We've now, albeit with some resistance, reached the point where there were frames, there were engines, and you could really begin the era of true automotive history that is, let's say, the last decade of the 19th century. At that particular point in time, vehicle designers truly started to fully realize that electric power, or let's say steam power, was a bit of a, how should I precisely put it, a definite dead end when it specifically came to driving on public roads. Because with trains, it was a completely and entirely different story altogether. In my opinion, the first 2 decades of the 20th century were the most beautiful and truly fantastic period in the development of the automotive industry, because people still didn't know which direction it would all go or how it would work. And they experimented as much as they could with designs, sometimes really great ones, and sometimes just downright crazy. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they didn't. Generally, it was a time when steam-powered vehicles, I'm talking about cars and motorcycles, were already fading into oblivion. Let's remember that steam engines were already about 200 years old by then. So it wasn't something that happened overnight. They were just slowly dying out like dinosaurs. By the way, do you know when the very first fuel crisis in Europe actually happened? It was back in the 19th century when almost all the forests in Great Britain and neighboring countries were cut down just to fuel the boilers of those steam engines. And not just the ones running on the roads, of course, but also those powering mines, textile machines, knitting machines, sawmills, and the entire industry. So even back then, people started to wonder what to do to find some reasonable fuel to put into those locomotives and steam engines in general. Of course, there were also coal mines. But the thing is, coal has to be transported and you need special containers for it. On the other hand, wood could just be chopped up. And in that respect, I would say it was somewhat better, although obviously less calorific. A little side note, when I was traveling around Great Britain for the first time a long time ago, I wondered why all the forests were so even and the trees grew so beautifully. I thought to myself, look, even in this respect, Europe is better organized than we are. And it was only later that my British motorcyclist friends explained to me that it's actually because they cut down all the forests. And basically, apart from some national parks, most of them are just artificial creations, let's say cultivated forests that simply had to be planted. And here's another interesting fact. Well, maybe it's a bit less appetizing, but at least it's interesting. Do you know what was most commonly used as fuel in locomotives on Egyptian railways? Mummies. They were perfect for burning, and there were simply countless numbers of them. Someone had accumulated them over a few thousand years, and they were buried in the ground. All you had to do was dig anywhere, and they would pull out these mummies, which were more or less suitable for burning under those steam boilers. So those were the kinds of inventions they used. Speaking of fuel, so one of the main problems with vehicles powered by combustion engines was the fuel, because you see, there were engines, something was exploding inside them, but there was no large-scale source for fuel. There were no gas stations Sure, there were some refineries that processed crude oil products into various fractions, and some of those were more or less suitable for burning and for use in combustion engines. But where were the first fuel stations? Gasoline was bought at pharmacies, at some chemical supply stores. In general, it was very difficult and hard to get, and let's say this was the 19th century, the end of it, the beginning of the 20th century. Initially, the octane rating of these fuels was really very poor, very low. That's why those engines had the compression ratio that they did. Even Harley, Indian, and let's say American side valve engines in the 1930s had a compression ratio of 5.5, 6.5. That was, I would say, normal, and that was because the low octane rating didn't allow for higher compression in those engines. However, the faster, so to speak, lighter fractions of these benzines were used, the more and more these engines were pushed, more and more. Of course, this particular aspect only applied to vehicles that were, so to speak, generally available to the public, not specialized racing cars, because I will talk about that in another upcoming episode of this very interesting series. What did performance and racing vehicles look like compared to civilian ones? And the difference was simply astronomical. It was like the difference between a space shuttle and, say, a Cinquecento, almost anyway. Gas stations, just like at first there were pharmacies, later on, already by the late 1910s, there were gas stations, and these stations, well, they were operated using these manual pumps. That reminded me of a story. Once I was sailing some probably down the Vistula toward the sea with a friend on a yacht, and we found on the shore in some bushes a very archaic fuel station pump, and it consisted of two glass cylinders, a manual pump and a larger underground tank. And basically, refueling worked by using the manual pump to transfer as much fuel as needed into the glass container, and then using a tap, the gasoline would flow by gravity into the car or motorcycle tank. That's how the first gas stations worked, and even in Poland, as far as I remember, it seems that the first stations like this appeared as early as the 1920s. The first official rides in combustion power vehicles, basically, you could say more of a tricycle, something between a car and a motorcycle by today's standards, was of course the famous ride by Mrs. Bertha Benz in 1888. And this was no longer just a case of it started, sputtered, stalled and broke down, so to speak. She drove that vehicle for over 90 kilometers, so over 120 years ago. These vehicles were already somehow able to move fairly quickly, to move efficiently. So even a woman unfamiliar with mechanics was simply able to drive that vehicle herself, to steer it somehow. Of course, something jammed or broke down 2 or 3 times, but still the vehicle just kept going. And from that moment on, you could say there was an explosion of ideas in the development of engines. Engines were built with 1 cylinder, 2 cylinders, 4 cylinders. Basically, whatever came to mind, even opposed piston engines. Here I wanted to say a few words about the very first valve mechanisms in such engines. Well, as I mentioned earlier, combustion engines originated from steam engines. As a result, the intake valve was an atmospheric valve, meaning it simply opened based on the principle that when the piston created a vacuum in the cylinder, the valve would lift and draw something in. I won't even mention those carburetors because that's a whole other story. It would draw in that first rather crude fuel-air mixture. It would draw it in, compress it, and only the exhaust valve was mechanically controlled, because there was no way to do it atmospherically anymore. As a result, these designs were engines where, to put it simply, the intake was above the exhaust, which today we might call overhead inlet engines. And I would say they actually work quite well. However, the development of this design later led to side valve engines, which I would say the Americans used very successfully, even, well, I wanted to say up until the war, but actually even into the 1970s. It seems that in the so-called service cars, that is Harley tricycles used by the police and so on, they were still using side valve engines from the WL model. As for the modification of this valve timing, the first push rods, you could say, were running, how should I put it, bare completely uncovered. Later on, however, in side valve engines, they introduced push rod covers, which was quite a significant step forward. These covers allowed for longer intervals between overhauls, let's call it that, simply because dust, dirt and sand couldn't get in. Although my friend Erwin Gorczyka claims that when he rode his overhead valve rashed with an exposed rocker assembly, it supposedly made no difference at all to the mileage. He put tens of thousands of kilometers on that bike, really pushing it hard, and those exposed rocker assemblies handled it just fine. However, logically speaking, valves, rocker assemblies and so on are simply more durable. Not only are they more durable, but they're also quieter. Of course, to adjust those valves, you do have to get in there and work on them and so on and so forth, but it definitely works. At first, overhead and side valves were used, and later, let's say, side valves. I'll talk about this in another episode as well, that racing vehicles were built with what I would call space-age technology for those times. Guessing which particular year were double overhead camshafts, often referred to as DOHC, and 4 valves per cylinder technologies utilized for the very first time in automotive history. No, it wasn't Japan or I would say America that did it. It was Peugeot who used this in their racing motorcycles in 1913. 4 valves per cylinder, 2 camshafts in the head. On this somewhat optimistic note, I wanted to end this short talk, although I suspect that one could talk much more about valve timing and engine designs. Listen, people used to put these engines at the front of the motorcycle. At the back there were radial engines like in the Megola, which rotated together, so to speak, with the wheel hub. They came up with all sorts of wild inventions. It seems that only in the 1930s, although even then there were some designs, I would say, but those were already rare and very exotic, that only the 1930s brought, I would say, the classic motorcycle design, which basically is still used today. That the engine sits in the frame and you sit, so to speak, a bit behind the engine. The drive is transmitted to the rear wheel, either by shaft, chain, or sometimes a belt. But what came before, that's exactly why I love those early years of motoring, because with those inventors you could really expect anything. I'll also mention that when these motorcycles started to go pretty fast with those engines, and they really did get fast, since they used, let's say, even 2.5-liter engines, there still weren't really any proper brakes. So next time I'll tell you how they later tried to tame these machines in some rather strange ways. So there will be a bit about suspensions and a bit about brakes.